I was teaching one of the Anchor House kids who stuck around after the lecture to ask me some questions. And he was telling me he was blown out at what a foul guy Abimelech and Jepthah are, the very guys we're talking about tonight. And he's like, what the actual heck? And so I was quoting for him what we actually started the book of Judges with, was his statement, which is, far from being stories about God's righteous people whose lives we should emulate. No, these are warnings for us about being power hungry and making rash, foolish decisions in our lives, and not considering God, but considering the things of this world, yeah? And warnings flashing. So I'm going to do a very, very brief review. I don't know that I need to necessarily apologize about the teaching from even last week and tonight. As you're aware, I'm trying to cover some really large chunks of narrative story. And I realized when I finished last week that I had sort of been like, fire hosing these stories. But I'm trying to keep a pace of, on average, 3 chapters a night so we can finish by Christmas. And to be quite frank with you, I don't feel bad about going quickly over it, because it's not like the book of Romans where we have 15 applications in 3 verses. It's more like 2 applications in 2 chapters. Does that make sense? So there's really no reason to go slow line by line. So forgive me if I'm reading large, because we got some large chunks we're going to cover. We're going to start with like 3 or 4 verses, and then we're going to do like 21 verses, right? So bear with me. So because of that, I'm going to kind of speed through the review tonight. I just really want to kind of review briefly the cycle of S's. We have sin, which leads to slavery and suffering, then crying out, which is supplication, leading to salvation and sanctification. Rob, if you're watching, yeah? And then finally shalom, which I think is the best word. Not silence, but shalom, the S word. And then the cycle goes again. Was somebody counting last week? Was the 4th or 5th? Was it 4th? Okay, get ready. I think we've got 2 more cycles, maybe 3 cycles tonight, actually, yeah? Oh, so last week we did Gideon. Interesting character study on an imperfect man who sometimes was faithful, but certainly not consistently. And typically when he's humble and faithful, he has amazing victories. But when he tries to hold and snatch power, he has total failure. And once again, ultimately, it was the women of the story that who come out of it as the heroes, okay? And so tonight, I read a quote. It actually came out of the NIV Life Application Bible. We're going to kick it off in verse 9 tonight, actually. We're going to try to do 9, 10, and 11. And I was just reading, and it was just one line in the summary of Abimelech, and I thought it was good. And it says this: ownership had changed. Abimelech no longer had power, but power had him. And I like that. And that makes you understand the ownership had changed. Abimelech starts with power, but in the end, power had him. And I thought it was interesting in the light of Sunday's sermon, which was all about power and authority, and who has power and who has authority, and how the power seems to shift and change based on our attitudes towards God and his power and his authority. So we're going to see a pretty disturbing story about Abimelech. So let's pick it up in chapter 9, verses 1 to 2. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them and to all his mother's clan, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? And remember, I am your flesh and blood." Okay. You see what he's doing here, right here? Real briefly, we covered a little bit of this last week. So Abimelech's dad is Gideon. And Gideon got a little power hungry at the end of his life and started acting like a king. Does anybody remember from last week? What does Abimelech mean? Son of the king. Even though, remember, technically, Israel's not supposed to have a king right now, right? And yet his name means son of a king. So Abimelech's mom is a concubine of Gideon. So not his actual wife. That's what's causing the trouble with all the other sons. He is sort of the illegitimate son. Now, Gideon's concubine, or Abimelech's mom, is likely a Canaanite, based on the context of the rest of the story. From Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. This is what God's law through Moses said about kings. And by the way, he says the word kings. I went back and looked it up, but this is what he says. When you go into the promised land and you have kings, Deuteronomy 17:17, he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray, and he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold, right? Or his heart will go astray. And that's what Gideon did. And so, one of the reasons I wrote that down was it's funny because people always like to use biblical polygamy to point out hypocrisy in the Christian faith. But they always completely ignore the fact that it always ends up in disaster. You can't really look at polygamy in the Old Testament and say, oh yeah, that was with God's blessing. No. It always ends up in disaster. So here's what happens. Abimelech wants power. And he's an outcast from the family of Gideon because he's illegitimate. So what he does is he goes to his uncles in Shechem for recruits, and it's kind of self-explanatory. He kind of pitches them on the idea, right? Why would you let these other guys rule over you? Why not have one guy? Oh, and I have a guy you might be interested in. Me, your own flesh and blood. He's quite the politician. By the way, since there's no mention of Shechem ever being conquered, it is assumed, and I checked with a few different guys, Shechem is a Canaanite city, okay, being ruled over by Gideon's family. Okay, in fact, I wrote in my notes, I wanted to read you the NIV Life Application notes. Let me read them. With Gideon dead, Abimelech wanted to take his father's place. To set his plan in motion, he went to the city of Shechem, his mother's hometown, to drum up support. Here he felt kinship with the residents. These relatives were Canaanites and would be glad to unite against Israel. Shechem was an important crossroads for trade routes and a natural link between the coastal plain and the Jordan Valley. Whoever controlled Shechem would dominate the countryside. So pick up the story in verse 3. When the brothers repeated all of this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. And they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless adventurers. We'll come back to that. Who became his followers. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem to crown Abimelech king. Okay, so no surprise here. Abimelech's a murderer. He murders for power. He has a deep desire to have power. I did a sort of deep dive into the Hebrew words for reckless adventurers. And here's what I came up with. Mortal, stupid, empty, and energetic. So some have used, like, you know, when Song of Solomon, vanity, 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 it's like an emptiness. It quite literally means empty-headed mortal men with lots of energy. So you sort of get reckless, like get it, stupid, like not super bright adventurers, right? Empty-headed, okay? And it's kind of an insult a little bit, yeah? But the most, what's that? A little, yeah. But the most important word here is actually in verse 6, I lost my place, to crown Abimelech king. This is interesting. I had never thought about it this way, but technically, Abimelech becomes the first person to ever be crowned king of Israel. I wrote in my notes, if you ever want to win a bar bet, you know, the next time you're drinking with a Christian who thinks they know their Bible, right? Ask him, who is the first king of Israel? Because you know what I would have said? Saul. I would have said Saul. but technically this is the first crowned king of Israel. And by the way, how does it work out? Now let's just finish the story. Okay, so I'm going to read a long section right now. It's just a lot of narrative, so bear with me. Pretend you're in Sunday school. When Jotham was told about this, he climbed up. Remember, he was the one brother that got away. The youngest brother, he got away. And he stands up on a hill. He climbed up on the top of Mount Gerizim, and he shouted to them, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem, so that God may listen to you." One day, the trees went out to anoint a king for themselves. And they said to the olive tree, "Be our king." But the olive tree answered, "Should I give up my oil, by which both gods and men are honored, to hold sway over the trees?" Next, the trees said to the fig tree, "Come and be our king." But the fig tree replied, "Should I give up my fruit, so good and sweet, to hold sway over the trees?" Then the trees said to the vine, "Come and be our king." But the vine answered, "Should I give up my wine, which cheers both gods and men, to hold sway over the trees?" Finally, all the trees said to the thorn bush, "Come and be our king." And the thorn bush said to the trees, "If you really want to anoint me king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, then let fire come out of the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon." Now, if you have acted honorably and in good faith when you made Abimelech king, and if you have been fair to Jerubbaal and his family, and if you have treated him as he deserves, and to think that my father fought for you, risked his life to rescue you from the hand of Midian, but today you have revolted against my father's family, murdered his 70 sons on a single stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his slave girl, king over the citizens of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you have acted honorably and in good faith toward Jerubbaal and his family today, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. But if you have not, let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come out from you, citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech. Then Jotham fled, escaping to Beer, where maybe presumably had a cold one. That's a stupid joke. I looked it up. Beer actually means place of the well. It's a well, yeah? And he lived there because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech. Okay, long narrative story that is titled Jotham's Fable. It's you catch the gist of the fable. So the trees went to what was the first tree? I forgot already. Olive tree, and then a fig tree, and then a vine, and then which one finally goes to the thorn bush. And then in verse 16, Jotham himself sort of gives the explanation of the parable. So briefly this, olive trees, fig trees, and vine trees, in case it's not obvious, and it wasn't obvious to me, so maybe it's not obvious to you, these are all very valuable trees, producing fruit, producing crops. Obviously, the thorn bush is not valuable at all. In fact, usually, guess what they used it for? Burning fires, creating fires, right? So Tim Keller said this. Essentially, he says, if you have been fair to Gideon's family in making Abimelech your king, and let's face it, you have not, then you may find great blessing in the rule of King Abimelech. But if you have not, and you have not, then I hope you and he get what you all deserve. You burned by him, and he burned by you, which, as we'll see how this story comes out, it's a pretty prophetic statement. By the way, I didn't know this, but apparently scholars have a nickname for Abimelech. Anybody know what it is? The Thornbush King. I found that a couple different guys called him that. So let's pick up the story in verse 22. Where are we going to go? 25. After Abimelech had governed Israel 3 years, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, who acted treacherously against Abimelech. Now that's interesting, yeah? God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem, who had helped him murder his brothers. In opposition to him, these citizens of Shechem met men on the hilltops to ambush and rob everyone who passed by, and this was reported back to Abimelech. Now, a lot of people have stumbled over this line. In fact, it's really not this line. It's the line in, I forget, it's 1st or 2nd Samuel when it says God sent an evil spirit to torture Saul, I believe, was it? Yeah? This is a very similar line. However, I gotta say, I thought, okay, let's prepare to explain that away. But apparently it's not that controversial of a statement to the guys that I've been studying. They barely even mentioned it. Wolf, who's kind of the most conservative and deeply intellectual of the three guys I've been reading, just said this, quote, God allowed a spirit to torment just as with Saul. And that was all he felt necessary to say. John MacArthur said this, he allowed a spirit of ill will. And my own words on it was, God has the power on this earth. In fact, if you're familiar with the biblical teaching, he is actively withholding evil, right? Holding it back on the earth. So what most guys seem to get, the gist of what I read today, is in this instance, God just sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a proactive, what's the opposite? It's like a submissive mood, or it's a judo move. He just removes his protection. That's all he really does. Removes his protection, and he allows this, which I saw it almost in terms of when he says in Romans 1, wrath, so God handed them over, right? In other words, the wages of sin is death. Sin is its own reward. And God says, fine, if that's what you want, that is my allowable will for you. I will hand you over. By the way, I didn't bring it up on Sunday because I didn't want to do too much of a bunny trail, but since Tuesday nights are all about bunny trails, I'll share it with you. In John 19:16, or 19:19, the last line of the story from Sunday's sermon was, and Pilate handed over Jesus to be crucified. And I went and looked up the word perididimos or something like that, and I went and cross-referenced it with the 3 times in Romans 1 where he uses it in the context of judgment. And chicken skin moment, it's no surprise, the same word. And I cannot believe that's just a coincidence that when Paul writes about God's wrath and God's judgment, he uses that word. And what we have in John chapter 19 is an explanation from God that he will receive the judgment that was to go onto mankind by using the same verbiage. God allowed his son to be handed over to judgment. Isn't that crazy? Anyways, I didn't want to go down that bunny trail on Sunday, but I was like, wow, of course that is the word that is used when Pilate, that's what I think too. The truth, they couldn't handle the truth, right? Right. Okay, so here's my final quote regarding God sending an evil spirit. This is me putting words in God's mouth, so forgive me, but my take on it is this. Well, you want to dabble with pagan gods, right? You want to dabble with pagan gods? Then you can go ahead, and you end up with a spirit to torment you. Guess what happens, right? That's it. Okay, so let's, this is kind of dumb. This is like, I don't know, when I read it, these are my own words. This is a drunken boast. Anybody here ever heard a drunken boast? Okay. No, nobody in this room. Now, verse 26. Now, Gael, it's got to be pronounced Gael, right? I mean, if it's Baal, it's got to be Gael, right? Not Gaul. I always want to say Gaal and Gaul. But Gael. Is everybody with me? I didn't look it up. Okay, Gael. Verse 26, now Gael, son of Ebed, moved with his brothers into Shechem, and its citizens put their confidence in him. After they had gone into the fields and gathered the grapes and trod them, they held a festival in the temple of their god. Now notice, these are Canaanite pagans. While they were eating and drinking, they cursed Abimelech. Then Gael, son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech, and who is Shechem that we should be subject to him? Isn't he Jerubaal's son? Isn't Zebul his deputy? Serve the man of Hamor, Shechem's father. Why should we serve Abimelech? If only this people were under my command, then I would get rid of them. I would say to Abimelech, call out your whole army. So just so you know what's going on here, this is a drunken bacchanal festival. I don't think I'm stretching the truth one iota to say Gael is hammered, right? And what's happened is these are Canaanites who have come under, they're under the authority of Abimelech, who's a Jew. He's an Israelite. And he has put this guy, where is it, Zebul? What is it, Zebul? Yeah, Zebul. Zebul is the Israelite commander who's in charge of Shechem. And Gael is kind of feeling his oats a little bit, going, I'm under these Jews, right? If everybody followed me, I'd kick his butt, right? Did you guys go to college? Have you ever never seen this kind of? Okay, I saw tons of this stuff. Who's that guy think he is? Yeah, right. Anyways, okay.
Beer muscles.
Beer muscles. Yeah, that's it. We've heard of beer goggles. These are beer muscles. Okay. Now, by the way, notice the irony of the statement, though. Abimelech has, remember Abimelech used his mother's heritage. Hey, aren't we all brothers, right? To bring Shechem pagans to his side. And now Gael is using Abimelech's father's heritage, right? For the same purpose, just reversed. It's all politicking. Is that the word? Politicking? Politicking. It's all politicking, right? Abimelech shows up and he's like, hey man, I'm one of you. My mom's a Canaanite, right? and what's his name here? Gael is going, his dad's a Jew. He's not one of us, right? All playing to their side. So it doesn't work out very well for him. Verse 30, when Zebul, the governor, by the way, we're going to see Zebul, pretty smart dude. And you almost get the sense that he's the sober one, right? Check it out. Where are we going to read to? All the way to 41. Okay. When Zebul, the governor of the city, heard that Gael, son of Ebed, heard what Gael, the son of Ebed, said, he was very angry. And undercover, he sent messengers to Abimelech, saying, Gael, son of Ebed, and his brother have come to Shechem and are stirring up the city against you. Now then, during the night, you and your men should come and lie in wait in the fields. In the morning at sunrise, what condition is Gael going to be in at sunrise? And the whole town, right? At sunrise, advance against the city. When Gael and his men come out against you, do whatever your hand finds to do. So Abimelech and all his troops set out by night and took up concealed positions near Shechem in 4 companies. Now Gael, son of Ebed, had gone out and was standing at the entrance of the city gate. Are you picturing him in your head? Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief, right? Just as Abimelech and his soldiers came out from their hiding place. And when Gael saw them, he said to Zebul, look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. And Zebul replied, oh no, you're not seeing it. You mistake the shadows of the mountains for men. Look how sly he is, yeah? But Gael spoke up again and said, I don't know, look, people are coming down from the center of the land, and a company is coming from the direction to the soothsayer's tree. Watch this. Then Zebul said to him, where's your big talk now? You who said, who is Abimelech, that we should be. It's like Eddie Haskell, right? Veggie Tales. That'd be a great Veggie Tales, yeah. Is it a Veggie Tales? No. I don't know. It would be a great one. You can picture it, though. Aren't these the men you ridiculed? Go out and fight them. So Gael led the citizens of Shechem and fought Abimelech, and you know what's going to happen. Abimelech chased him, and many fell wounded in the flight all the way to the entrance of the gate. Abimelech stayed in Aramuth, and Zebul drove Gael and his brothers out of Shechem. I don't even know that I need to explain much. You can all get the gist. It was just a big-time defeat. By the way, this Zebul guy is obviously, he's an Israelite, and he's one smart bugger. And then look what happens, verse 42. The next day, the people of Shechem went out in the field, and this was reported to Abimelech. These are the regular rank and file. So he took his men, divided them into 3 companies, set an ambush in the fields. And when he saw the people coming out of the city, he rose to attack them. Abimelech and his companies with him rushed forward to a position at the entrance of the city gate. Then 2 companies rushed upon those in the fields and struck them down. And all that day, Abimelech pressed his attack the city until he had captured it and killed its people. Then he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. Wow. On hearing this, the citizens in the tower of Shechem went into the stronghold of the temple of El-Berith. And when Abimelech heard that they had assembled there, he and all his men went up to Mount Zalman, and he took an axe, cut off some branches, which he lifted to his shoulders, and ordered the men with him, quick, do what you have seen me do. So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech, and they piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire. Remember the Jotham prophecy? Over the people inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. What a wonderful, heartwarming story. By the way, John Enns has told me that there's a teaching by Tim Mackey that says episodes like this are not done with the authority of God, right? Does that make sense? These are not the righteous people of the Bible of which we are to emulate. Does that make sense? Yeah? That God himself is abhorred by such violence like this, okay? Maybe more on that as we move further through the book. But here, basically, this little section right here, the townspeople seem to naively believe that with the death of Gael, that there will be no more trouble from Abimelech, but they're sadly mistaken. And again, if you think, why would a good God have his ruler slaughter these people? Think again. This is a story not written as a great victory for God, but actually a sad state of affairs. In fact, the commentator Wolfe said this: his vindictive action, however, destroyed the main city of his own kingdom and left him with little to rule. And so it was actually a bonehead move in the end. And so let's wrap up the story of Abimelech, and then if you have questions or comments, we'll get there. 50 to 57. Next, Abimelech went to Thebes and besieged it and captured it. Inside the city, however, was a strong tower, which all the men and women, all the people of the city fled. They locked themselves in and climbed up on the tower roof. Abimelech went to the tower and stormed it, but as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. What a great story. Hurriedly, he called his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so they can't say a woman killed him." You guys starting to see a theme in the book of Judges here, yeah? So his servant ran him through, and he died. And when the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. Thus, God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. Are you catching that? This was on Abimelech. This is God's judgment on Abimelech. God also made the men of Shechem pay for all their wickedness. Is there a hero in the story? God. Thank you. Good answer. When in doubt, just say Jesus. Right. Yeah. The curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, came on them. Okay, let me briefly comment on it, and then we can pause if you all have a question or a comment. The upper millstone. This is interesting because it goes back to the story of Jael, not Gideon, but Barak. This goes back to the story of Barak and Deborah and Jael. But the upper millstone. So you can. Do I need to explain it to you? The big millstone is the big one that I think. The big one is the one that you get wrapped around your neck if you cause any of these little ones to stumble from the New Testament. The smaller one is like the rolling pin that you use to crush the wheat, right? I don't know much, but yeah. And so that was sort of like a smaller, like a rolling pin shaped thing that you would roll. And so again, just like the story of, what was the king's name that Jael killed? Anybody from the story of Barak and Deborah? And he came against Sisera. I'm so glad I got that. I should know that. Hello, I'm the teacher. Just like, okay, so remember, Jael uses what? A tent stake. I remember it was the women who erected the tents and who used the hammer and used the stake. And so it was an insult that he was killed by a woman with the tools of a woman. Look what's happening right here. She takes a woman's tool and she has the ultimate victory by cracking his noggin, right? Yeah, any questions or comments? Applications?
Were they scattered salt?
Scattered salt. I don't know. And one of the commentators made a point about that what the salt would accomplish is kind of destroy it, ruin it, where you couldn't grow crops. And oddly enough, this is the place where Joseph's bones were supposedly buried. And so the whole story just has this like foul odor about it of desolation and destruction, you know?
How do you get that much salt in
Yeah,
there?
where did they get that?
Yeah, where do they get much salt? Well, just, yeah. Well, they're pretty close to the Salton Sea. I mean, not the Salton Sea, the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea. Remember, too, whenever you hear that stuff about salt, there's a couple different types of salt. This isn't table salt for eating.
No.
This is that's that cheap, yeah,
No,
rock
I'm
salt.
from the
Yeah.
north on the mainland, and we have salt put on the road, so
Oh, yeah, salt on the road. Yeah, you would know that way better than me.
Just wait
Yeah,
for that storehouse.
yeah.
There's more than one story in the Bible about that.
Pouring salt on them.
Yeah, the armies would come in and just destroy the land, not just for a while, but
So
for
they couldn't even
centuries.
farm it or
Yeah,
anything.
for centuries.
For
Yeah,
centuries. I've read that there's actually spots in Israel where they cannot
they
grow
still
stuff
can't grow.
because there's salt
So much
everywhere.
salt.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you wouldn't have to necessarily cover it in salt. If you just made enough patchwork of it, you couldn't grow a whole lot, right? It would just, only grow in patches. And then maybe once the salt gets into the soil, maybe you couldn't even see where it was, right? And so you wouldn't know where you could plant and where you couldn't. You would just abandon the whole area. Yeah, interesting. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? It's not, yes, Steve?
Well, the story starts off, to me, interesting when it says God sent an evil spirit, because that's always controversial and interesting. So then we see, where does it manifest? Well, it's this Gaul guy who suddenly erupts in animosity, casting doubt, self-promotion.
Yes.
He's like a train load full of bad sentiments.
Yeah.
And it's just like, "Bleh, here it comes. And then he starts the
Civil
but
War, yeah.
God is working the entire time.
Yes.
Letting everything play out to accomplish what he wants.
Judgment, yeah.
So, but I guess one of the things I see in this is that you can kind of judge where the Spirit of God is by whether or not, because isn't there a verse where the Spirit of God is, there is peace?
Right, yeah.
And here, all
It's
the opposite things
removed.
are like
It's removed, yeah.
erupting. Every evil work is manifesting out.
Well, that's a great point, and is not like a accurate description of hell as the absence of God, right? If heaven is being in the presence of God, hell would be accurately described as the absence of God, and here we have a case for it. In fact, interestingly enough, we're going to do a quick little 5-verse or 6-verse interlude before we get into the next kind of hideous story. And it's interesting because it's actually a good part, but there's like not much to tell. Like it's kind of sad. Like let me show you. Let's just read it. It's chapter 10, the first 5 verses. After the time of Abimelech, a man of Issachar, Tola, son of Pua. Sounds like they're Hawaiians. Tola and Pua. The son of Dodo. Now there's a biblical name. Nobody ever names their kid anymore. Rose to save Israel. Oh, look where we are. We're in the salvation mode, aren't we? Yeah. And he lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim, and he led Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried in Shamir. He was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys, and they controlled the towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth Jair. And when Jair died, he was buried in Kamon. And that's all we know about these people. Based on the context and the chronological order, they speculate that these guys' reign actually overlapped a little bit. They were probably both ruling at the same time. And the reason why that's possible is because from the tense of the word save Israel, which was last used during the time of Deborah, the assumption is these weren't military leaders. These were wise elders. And now think about it if you do the math. If you have wise elders that aren't power-hungry military commanders, they have no problem sharing power. It's like having wise elders of your church, so to speak. Does that make? They can work in concert with each other. And the word saved comes as God's promise, as it were. So it appears to be a good and prosperous and faithful time for Israel. So can we just maybe pause for a second and enjoy it?
Yeah.
Because it's not going to last. Okay. Anybody want to say anything before we move on to the next hideous story? I shouldn't talk so down on it, huh? Chase you guys away. I almost sound apologetic about it, don't I? I shouldn't sound apologetic. It's God's word, and he's teaching us through it, okay?
Sounds like roughly a generation of people.
Yeah, like a generation of, yeah, I would agree. If you're existing back then, you would want to hope to get born under a good time, of faithful leaders, because it sounds the 30 donkeys thing, the 30 sons and 30 donkeys is just a symbol of prosperity, like doing well, like they were thriving. I love that word, flourishing, thriving, yeah? Okay, well, let's keep moving then, okay, because we're going to get into Jepthah. He was titled as Jepthah the Outcast, okay? So verses 6 through 10. Here we go. And by the way, I just love the way the first word, again. Oh, no, right? Again. Where are we going to go? Till verse 10. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Aram and the gods of Sidon and the gods of Moab and the gods of the Ammonites and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, there's another S word, right? They sinned, they didn't serve, he became angry with them, and here's another S word, sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. And for 18 years they oppressed, there's slavery, another S word, all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. So this is all taking place in the eastern side of the Jordan. And the Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. That's all the west side of the Jordan. And Israel was in great distress. So insert the word suffer for our next S. Mm-hmm. Then the Israelites cried out. What's that? Supplication. The circle is in full effect. To the Lord, we have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals. Let's just unpack this very briefly. Again, same old song and dance, another S word. Sin, slavery, suffering, supplication. This is, by the way, one guy speculated this is such an extensive list of sins and conquering nations that it's possible that it's sort of a summary of the whole book as opposed to maybe just this one instance. I'm just saying it's possible, yeah? But what we have is a kind of an interesting response from God, 11 to 14. The Lord replied, when the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, and the Philistines, the Sidonians, and the Amalekites, and the Moabites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you are in trouble. Ouch. Ouch, yeah? Yes, Louis?
Was this put forth by a prophet? How did the word get to the people?
The Lord replied, I don't know. I don't know. It doesn't say. By the way, excellent question. Yeah? It says Yahweh replied when they cried out. My knee-jerk reaction is absolutely, you're right. It probably was a prophet. Now, thus far, we seem to always get a message from the angel of the Lord, which is a Christophany. So that would somewhat imply there was probably, a prophet around to whom God would reveal himself, who would be God's mouthpiece. But it's interesting. I didn't even notice that. I didn't even think about that when I was studying today. How did he communicate? Good question. By the way, to your point, this exact verbiage used here is extremely close to the exact verbiage used by the angel of the Lord in chapter 2, verse 3. It's almost exactly the same. And he points out to them that they obviously don't deserve saving, but notice that God smartly creates my word here, juxtaposition between his faithfulness. It's a nice biblical number. He points out 7 different instances where he was faithful and he saved them compared to their unfaithfulness. And so he, of course, hands them over. Tim Keller wrote this. the judgment for idolatry is idolatry, right? Yeah, so that's what God's saying. Oh, if you want to chase idols, ask them for help. Get it? The wages of sin is death. You get just what you wanted, so go. Anyways, okay. So then we're going to get to real repentance in verses 15 and 16, okay? It's one thing to cry out, help us, O God. 15 and 16, but the Israelites said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now. Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord. And he could bear Israel's misery no longer. I love that. Now, there's a lot in there that is not very well explained. I mean, we can they get rid of the foreign gods among them, and then they served the Lord. I found that interesting just because, remember, I've made this contention going back to the book of Judges, that God says, look, I'm going to create this area, and out of all the earth, I'm only going to claim this sliver of land, but it will be my land. And he'd given the Canaanites 400 years of warning, plus an additional 40 when they were coming through the desert. They knew, remember, Rahab makes it clear, we knew you were coming. And we were terrified of you because we knew that Yahweh was with you, right? But God says, anybody who will serve me. And that's what happens. There was all these different, the Gideonites or whatever it was that came in under, and they faked out the Israelites and said, we're poor, can we serve you? Even Caleb, the Moabite, was he Caleb? Edomite. Caleb, Edomite, Moabite, anybody? I forget. Not an Israelite. Caleb the spy, not an Israelite, comes in, serves Yahweh, and is giving a full promotion. Rahab herself is in the lineage of Christ. Obed-Edom the Gittite, ends up being put in charge of, anybody? The treasury of the temple. And he was a Philistine, Okay? You come in, so God says, I'm sorry, I'm preaching, I'll shut up quickly. Well, God says, I'm going to declare this area, and anybody who serves me, I will protect. Okay, now here's where we get an interesting, what we all want to know is, what does that actually mean that they served Yahweh? What it doesn't tell us is A, what they did, and B, for how long, right?
How did they know to?
And how did they know to? Because I'm guessing, does this mean they started sacrificing at the, not the temple, but it would be the tabernacle. Thank you. Does that mean they reconstructed the tabernacle? They went and offered sacrifices? I mean, throwing away the pagan gods is sort of like part one.
But who's the illuminary?
Yeah, who is the illuminary? So my point is, we don't have a lot of explanation. We don't know how long it went on for, but at a certain point, it says, what does it say? And the God could bear Israel's misery no longer, right? Okay. Okay, so we call this real repentance. So we pick up the story, verse 17. When the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. And the leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, whoever will launch the attack against the Ammonites will be the head of all those living in Gilead. So, 17 and 8. So I didn't finish. Jepthah, the Gilead, was a mighty warrior, and his father was Gilead, and his mother was a prostitute. And Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jepthah away. You're not going to get any inheritance in our family, they said, because you are the son of another woman. So Jepthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a group of adventurers gathered around him and followed him. Okay, we're going to unpack that a little bit too. Okay, so here come the Ammonites on the march. They're probably coming to raid the crops just like the Midianites did. Remember, the Midianites would come over across the Jordan at harvest time to raid the crops. That's very likely what was going on here. Israel, of course, has no commander at this time. And so Jepthah, which his name means he opens. And by the way, Jepthah we end up finding in the Hall of Faith, which by the end of the story, you're going to wonder why. But he was, this is how he was described. He had a very low rank in a high-ranking family because he was the offspring of Gilead, right? Okay, who is a very wealthy and powerful family, but he was the daughter of sorry, he was the mother, his mother was a prostitute. My only point on that is, once again, God choosing the least likely. Moses, David, Paul, right? Okay. It seems to be a powerful and ubiquitous biblical theme. Oh, even Gideon, remember, was the same thing, yeah? Now, the word where it says adventurer translates almost like mobster. These guys were, what's another word? Brigands. Is that right? Brigands, is that using the word? Like highway robbers, okay? Violent men is another way. However, the commentator Wolf reckons that while he was out in the desert wandering, he might have grown up a little bit in faith. And it's evidenced by some of the repeated words he says to Yahweh as the story continues. So let's continue his exile and recall. I think verse 4. So sometime later, when the Ammonites made war on Israel, the elders of Gilead went to Jepthah from the land of Tob. Come, they said, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. So he clearly had a reputation. Jepthah said to them, oh, didn't you hate me and drive me from... Doesn't this seem like a classic biblical theme? Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? And the elders of Gilead said to him, nevertheless, we are turning to you now. Come with us. It sounds like a VeggieTales thing, huh? Come with us, fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead. And Jepthah answered, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? And the elders of Gilead replied, the Lord is our witness. Okay, this is a heavy, vow, oath. We will certainly do as you say. So Jepthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Then Jepthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, what have you against us so that you have attacked our country? And the king of the Ammonites, pay attention because we're going to have Amorites and Ammonites and it's going to get confusing. The king of the Ammonites answered Jephtah's messengers, when Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peacefully. Okay, so Israel's claim on the land, and Jepthah tries to begin with a peaceful negotiation. But the Ammonites want their quote-unquote occupied territory back. Does that sound familiar? The occupied territories of Israel. Boy, some things never change, do they? Yeah? Isn't that crazy how this is going on? Now, here's the thing. I'm going to read a really long section, and forgive me, I think there are a lot of really long sections tonight, yeah? That's pretty confusing, but Jephtah's kind of retell the story about how this all went down. The shortest way I think I can explain it to you, because it's really not worth getting into the gritty details, is there was some issues, there was some land divisions, and basically Jepthah and the king of the Ammonites have a different perspective on what went down with some legalities. So let me just go ahead and read it. Oh boy, it's a long section. Here we go. Jepthah sent back the messengers to the Ammonite king, saying, this is what Jepthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. But when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the desert to the Red Sea and on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, give us permission to go through your country. But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh. Next they traveled through the desert, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab and camped on the other side of the Arnon. They did not enter the territory of Moab, for the Arnon was its border. Then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and said to him, "Let us pass through your country to our own place." Sihon, however, did not trust Israel to pass through his territory, and he mustered all his men and encamped at Jahaz, and he fought with Israel. Then the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his men into Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over all the land of the Amorites, with an R, who lived in the country, capturing all of it from the Arnon to the Jebab, to the desert, to the Jordan. Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people Israel, what right do you have to take it over? Will you not take what your God, Chemosh, that's their pagan god, gives you? This is, by the way, some classic stuff here. Likewise, what the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Did you see what he did right there? Why don't you take what your God gives you, and we'll take what our God gives us? That was interesting, yeah? Are you better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with him? For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, and the surrounding settlements and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I have not wronged you, but you are doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, oh, good title for this book, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. Okay.
A lot of history there.
What a big chunk right there. So in the book of Numbers, God commands Israel not to fight against Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Why? Because they are all Semites. They are all loosely related. Moab from the son of Lot. Edom is the descendants of Esau. And the Ammonites are the descendants of Ben-Ami, which is the, offspring. Remember Lot had sex with his daughters, and it's really awkward? That is where they trace their lineage too. So God told the Israelites, don't fight against Edom, Moab, or Ammon, but they do fight against the Amorites, so that when they attack, to the victors be the spoils. You know what that reminded me of? Remember the 6-Day War? What did that cost Egypt? The Sinai Peninsula. For how many years? I forget how many years. Yeah, Egypt attacks Israel during the 6-Day War, 1967. Is that right? Yeah? 1967. And so Israel's like, then you lose the Sinai Peninsula. We'll be taking that now.
And then the Israeli general gives the dome back to the...
Gave the dome, right, yeah. They did. They could have taken it, didn't it? Yeah, smart move. Anyways, and then eventually, of course, as you remember, Israel did give back the Sinai Peninsula. But you want to fight us? Fine, we'll take your land. To the victor be the spoils. Yeah. Brilliant use of why don't you ask your God for help? By the way, I wrote in my notes, we often forget how much the deities figure into these battles. We forget. We don't think about it that way because we're like, oh yeah, they were like, Buddhists and against the Christians or whatever. No. The way they actually saw it back then was your God versus our God. In fact, you know what it reminded me of? Remember the plagues against Egypt? Do you remember that they weren't just random? There didn't just happen to be a plague of frogs and there just happened to be a plague of flies. But each plague specifically was linked to a small g pagan god of Egypt. So it was a picture of Yahweh being the Lord of all creation by eliminating each Egyptian god and showing that he had sovereignty over all. Does that make sense? Yeah? And so this is sort of a clash between Chemosh. It actually in the Hebrew was with a hard K, Chemid or whatever. Chemosh or Chemish it was. Chemish in the Hebrew. Against Yahweh. And also a nice mention of Balak, who, by the way, never fought Israel, but he made a disastrous attempt to curse Israel using Balaam. Remember that? And then Balaam's ass speaks. And then remember, what does Balaam do? He blesses Israel. Yeah, which is a great start. Okay, we're almost done, and we've only got about 8 minutes left. So verses 28 to 33. The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message. Jepthah, all that history for nothing. Sorry, I had to read that. I read that whole thing for nothing. Okay, whatever. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jepthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jepthah made a vow to the Lord. And this is where it gets really stupid. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Then Jepthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands, and he devastated 20 towns from Aror to the vicinity of the Minth, and as far as Abel Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. Before we get to the hideous section of the story, it's a crazy, stupid vow. This does not have the blessing of God, just so you know. And this whole story is in the context of a complete blow-it. Just so you know, one of the main, quote-unquote, set-apart rules, remember, the root of the word holy is set apart, and Israel is to be holy. And one of the main things that is so important to God that will set them apart from pagan cultures is Israelites are never to use humans as sacrificial, to sacrifice, right? And there doesn't seem to be any evidence here whatsoever that Jepthah thinks he's going to come home and an animal is going to come out of his tent. And so right from the get-go, there's no excuse for Jepthah on this. Human sacrifice is strictly forbidden by God all throughout the law. And the Ammonites did so. So some try to excuse this by saying maybe he meant whatever animal, but even in the Hebrew, it does not support this. And so now we read the devastating part of the story. Verse 32, when Jepthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines. She was an only child, which again adds to the stupidity of all of this. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and he cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched because I have made a vow to the Lord and I cannot break it." What's that?
Pretty lame statement.
Oh,
You have brought
oh,
me
it's so selfish. Thank you, Louis. It's so selfish to the core.
woman you gave me.
Yeah, exactly. That woman you gave me. He's like almost verbatimly quoting Adam right there. Yeah. "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said, "give me 2 months," this is bizarre, "to roam the hills and weep with my friends because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. And she and the girls,
Keep going.
I know, I guess they went camping into the hills and wept because she would never marry. And after the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her just as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. And from this time, the Israelites' custom that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jepthah, the Gileadite. It's a devastating victory and a devastating event. Again, it's a super bizarre, this homecoming. What should have been a raucous celebration becomes one of intense mourning, as in a major defeat. By the way, the Hebrew verbiage is as if they had lost the battle. This is also his only child, so it portends the end of his family line. Now, the daughter's response, no word on the mom's response. Did anybody think of that? Where's mom in all this? You knucklehead, right? But her response is really interesting because yet again, it puts her faith and her actions in the story as being superior to the men in the story. In other words, the commentator Wolf compares it to Isaac trusting Abraham, that if it were necessary for her to be sacrificed for victory over the Ammonites, there seems to be the sense that she feels it's worth it. However, unfortunately, as we all understand it, it wasn't necessary. It's just really sad. Jepthah knew it was a sin to break a vow, but in this case, the greater sin is to not fulfill it.
Wasn't it during the time of Daniel where it's noted that the decree of the Assyrian or the Babylonians can never be revoked? It was a thing
A
in
thing,
those days
right, yeah.
where people in leadership would make a decree and it could never
Be revoked, right, yeah,
showing
yeah.
how, whatever they
Right.
were.
By the way, that doesn't change much. I mean, we look at our constitution of our country as about the same thing, don't we? You can't change the Constitution. Why not? Well, I don't know, because God made it, I guess, yeah?
There's provision for changing.
Yeah, okay. Anyways, but people, in general, don't want to change it.
You definitely could
right.
have changed
I know,
it
yeah.
because it's not for the blessing of God.
Say that again, Jen?
You definitely could have changed it because it's not of the blessing of God.
Oh, it's clear, the whole thing.
So,
Yeah, it's all. So let me wrap up with these ideas because we're just about out of time. It's a terrible story. Some commentators reckon this is likely evidence of his being influenced by the surrounding cultures. Yeah? So he doesn't end up exactly a faithful, godly man, even though he gets off to a good start. Tim Keller said something interesting. He looked at it as an episode as if Jepthah had been influenced by pagan works righteousness, right? Because human sacrifice was how you influenced pagan gods. And so he sort of adopted a pagan mindset. But God is exactly polar the opposite. You don't, check this out. This is a good point. This is a good teaching point for the night. If you're wondering where are we going with all of this, pay attention to this part. In God's view, you don't sacrifice other people. Jepthah doesn't offer himself. He offers his daughter. You practice self-sacrifice through practice and love. Let me read you some verses. This is from Micah chapter 6, verses 6 to 8. I kind of thought of this on my own because these are some of my most favorite verses in the Old Testament. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn? You see what he's saying? For my transgressions? The fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? No. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. And by the way, I picked those two out of a list of about this many verses that talk about how real sacrifice is when we lay down our lives and sacrifice our own needs for the love and the service of others, right? Yeah. Jepthah probably has no concept of God's grace and therefore believed, well, I made a vow to continue God's favor, I have to do this. And he superstitious. And he completely swing and a miss. And so I'll wrap up with this idea. Works righteousness is always just playing games. The Pharisees of Jesus' times had lost the plot. They had removed all love from the commandments, and they had turned God's law into religious works righteousness ritual, which I believe is when they asked Jesus what is the greatest commandment, he returns it to the idea of sacrificial love. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor. Like, it's the giveaway. John Enns has a really interesting theory. He's been going through the book of Genesis, and he says there's a Hebrew verbiage where every character in Genesis can be characterized either as a giver or a taker. Yeah? Cain and Abel. Abel gives, Cain takes. And he says it's real subtle, but it's all through there. We are called to sacrifice and give of ourselves, not take a life from another person, right? All right, wow. Okay, we're right at quitting time. Did anybody have one thing they were like dying to say, or should we just wrap it up? Jepthah's bargaining with God. In fact, I actually have the name of a person here I won't read. who's somebody a lot of us know from around this church. He's been part of this church for 20 years. He came out of a Catholic background. And he used to actually kind of practice what I would call, you used the word earlier, superstition. Like making deals with God. In fact, that reminds me of another brother that Steve and I know real well, that we used to meet with on a real regular basis, who has a Jewish background, who's always making deals with God. Well, I made a deal with God. If I did this, then he'll do this. And we're always going, dude, you can't do that. That's not how it works. What does he say? This is your spiritual act of worship, right? Lay your own life down on the altar. Give your life to God. And then let him decide how he's going to interact with you. But you can't make deals with God. Do this and I'll do that. Because what can we ever give to God? What does he need from us, ever? Nothing. It's ludicrous. It's insane to think, I got something you need, God. I'll make a deal with you. We bargain with nothing. It's a good point. Thank you, Betty, for bringing it up. I actually had it in my notes. I kind of forgot. All right, let's pray. Father God, thank you for your word. As awkward and weird and somewhat depressing as these can be somewhat, Lord, this is the world we live in. This is the reality of the world that surrounds us. And so thank you, God, because what you give us, Lord, is tools. And you give us direction and instruction on how we ought live our lives before you. And so we're grateful for that tonight, Lord. My prayer is that somehow that we believe what your word says, that your word does not come back void, that even these bizarre stories that we read here together on a Tuesday night, Lord, are driven deep into our hearts and bearing fruit, perhaps even in waves supernaturally we don't even understand. Our goal is to give you glory and to live out lives of faithfulness before you. And we ask that you would give us assistance to do that and be glorified out of it. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.